Could you believe that this grotesque walrus was actually made by a real man? Its tusks were carved from human tibia bones. Its skin was stitched together again and again, but just a few days earlier, he had still been an ordinary man. A man named Wallace and his friend Teddy hosted a popular show called The Nazi Party, where they mocked bizarre news and humiliating viral videos. One of the videos they laughed at featured the Kill Bill Kid, a boy who accidentally severed his own leg with a katana sword. To cash in on the buzz, Wallace decided to fly to Canada to interview the Kill Bill Kid. But when he arrived, he learned that the boy, unable to handle the cyberbullying and ridicule, had taken his own life. Wallace felt frustrated for coming all this way for nothing. In the bar restroom, he stumbled upon a handwritten flyer on the wall. The flyer offered a free room in a remote home from an elderly man named Howard in exchange for listening to his fascinating life stories. Wallace thought it was perfect podcast material. Quirky old sailor with bizarre tales. He immediately contacted Howard and drove out to his secluded mansion. There, Wallace met Howard. He seemed friendly, but he moved around only in a motorized wheelchair. As Wallace sipped the tea Howard made, he admired the luxurious house. He couldn't believe such a mansion existed in the middle of nowhere. Howard told him that when he was 16, working as a cook on a ship, he once met Hemingway, and the two drank together like friends. Wallace was fascinated and wanted to hear more, but Howard told him to look by the fireplace. The old wine bottle was still there. Just then, Wallace noticed a strange decorative item nearby, a bone from a walrus's private part. Howard explained his obsession with walruses, which came from a shipwreck in 1959. His ship struck an iceberg, and minutes later the whole vessel sank with the crew. He alone survived, clinging to a lifebuoy until he reached a rock. Starving and freezing, he was saved when a walrus appeared and warmed him with its body. After the story, Wallace felt dizzy. He tried to drink more tea, but suddenly passed out. The tea had been drugged. When he woke up, he was sitting in a wheelchair. His face looked pale. A blanket covered his body, and soft music mixed with scraping sounds filled the air. Not far away, Howard was carefully polishing a bone. Wallace accepted the drink Howard handed him, and groggily took a few sips. Howard told him he had been bitten on the leg by a venomous spider the night before, and that was why he fainted. Wallace wanted to call his family, but Howard said his phone was broken. Though awake, Wallace's mind was hazy. He had no feeling in his left leg, and even forgot Howard's name. Howard warned him to prepare himself. To stop the venom from spreading, a doctor had performed an emergency amputation. Wallace pulled off the blanket and saw that his left leg was missing. The shock made him briefly clear-headed. If surgery was done, why wasn't I in a hospital? Howard answered, "Hospitals are full of viruses. Here you will recover better." Wallace demanded to speak to the doctor, but Howard claimed the doctor was busy on rotation. He told Wallace to rest. At dinner, Wallace finally realized the truth. There had never been a spider bite. There was no doctor. Howard, who looked so kind, was actually a deranged man. Because he was strapped to the chair, Wallace could only scream in rage. Howard no longer pretended. He slapped Wallace and declared he would transform him into a human walrus. Not only would Wallace look like one, he would act and live as one too. Hearing this, Wallace completely broke down. He screamed in despair, regretting deeply. If only he had listened to his girlfriend Allie and never come to Canada, none of this would have happened. But regret was useless now. Meanwhile, Allie felt heartbroken because Wallace always cared more about work than her. Luckily, Teddy was there to comfort her whenever she was sad. That night, Wallace heard the phone ring. He tried to answer, but he was too late. It was Allie who had called. Wallace quickly called back, but it didn't go through. He tried Teddy too, but also failed. What Wallace didn't know was that the two people most important to him were secretly having an affair. Helpless, Wallace left a message saying he had been kidnapped and begged them to come rescue him. But before he could finish, Howard appeared, struck him on the head with a stick and coldly whispered, "Your life is over. If you wish to continue living, you will be a walrus, or you'll be nothing at all." The next morning, Allie finally saw Wallace's message. She and Teddy realized how serious the problem was. Meanwhile, Wallace's body was undergoing Howard's insane transformation. The walls of the operating room were covered with blueprints of the surgery. It was clear that Howard hadn't acted on impulse. He had been planning this for a long time. While cutting and stitching Wallace's body, Howard kept talking about his past. As expected, behind every madman, there was usually an unfortunate childhood. When Howard was 10, he watched his parents get stabbed to death by robbers. For the next 5 years, he stayed in an orphanage, but to save money, the government turned the orphanage into a mental asylum. The children who had been perfectly normal were all treated like lunatics. They lived a cruel and inhuman life. People turned a blind eye. No one tried to rescue them. At 15, Howard finally escaped the hell. He boarded a ship to America. In his eyes, walruses, though fierce in appearance, were loyal and compassionate. It was humans who were the most cruel and heartless animals. When the story ended, Wallace's stage 1 surgery was complete. Besides losing both legs, his arms had also been sewn to his body. After several more rounds of modification, Wallace's appearance was fully turned into that of a walrus. Howard even gave him the same name as the walrus that once saved his life, Mr. Tusk. Since his tongue had been cut out, Wallace could no longer speak. He could only roar hysterically. Howard scolded him to be quiet. Real walruses didn't scream like that. To help Wallace understand walruses, Howard forced him to watch training videos every day. But that was not enough. To be a true walrus, he also had to learn to swim. Before Wallace was ready, Howard flipped a switch. The chains on his legs dragged him into the water. Sinking to the bottom, Wallace was horrified. He discovered he was not the first victim. Others who had been transformed were already skeletons underwater. Meanwhile, Allie and Teddy still couldn't find Wallace. They had no choice but to report to the local police. The officer heard Wallace's message but didn't fully believe it. He thought it might be a prank. Still, after Allie's desperate request, the police agreed to issue a missing person notice. But when he learned that Wallace's legs had been cut off, the officer suddenly remembered something. 2 days earlier, a man had asked them if any severed legs had been found. He said he was tracking a serial killer. As they left the station, the officer gave Allie and Teddy that man's phone number. The man in sunglasses was named LaPointe. He had worked as a policeman for 20 years and was now a private detective. For the past decade, LaPointe had been chasing the elusive monster Howard, but had never succeeded. Now, Allie and Teddy had found the very man they needed. When LaPointe heard Wallace might be in Howard's hands, he grew excited. He told them Howard was responsible for 23 deaths. His method was always the same. The victims' legs were severed, their arms sewn to their torsos, their tongues removed, and strange wounds were left in their mouths. Without exception, fragments of human leg bones were found inside their oral cavities. Listening to this, Allie and Teddy were stunned. 2 years earlier, LaPointe had met Howard once. During a missing person investigation, he had visited Howard's home. Howard had almost invited him in for tea, but back then, LaPointe had no idea that the seemingly harmless old man was actually the deranged killer he had been hunting. Now LaPointe made a bold assumption. Howard was using human bodies to build monstrous abominations. At the same time, Wallace was unknowingly going through a terrifying transformation. Howard tossed him a fish. Wallace didn't want to eat it, but he was starving. In the end, he ate it out of desperation. Allie and the others arrived at the convenience store where Wallace had once bought a drink. The cashier immediately recognized Wallace from the photo. Fortunately, when Wallace had spoken on the phone with Howard, he had scribbled the mansion's address on the store's notepad. LaPointe rubbed the page with a pencil and managed to recover the crucial clue. Meanwhile, Howard was patiently teaching Wallace to swim. He imagined the creature before him was truly Mr. Tusk. He explained that the place was built to resemble the cave where he once lived with the walrus. Howard's eyes suddenly grew sad. After being saved by the walrus back then, he had faced starvation. To survive, he had no choice but to kill the walrus and eat its flesh raw. Eventually, a rescue team found him, but the guilt of killing the walrus haunted him for the rest of his life. From that moment on, he developed the idea of transforming humans. He wanted Wallace to live in place of Mr. Tusk. Allie and Teddy discovered Wallace's car submerged in water, so they guessed he had to be nearby. LaPointe handed Allie and Teddy each a small pistol. He kept the bigger weapon for himself. Howard dressed in a walrus suit and forced Wallace to fight him. Back then, Mr. Tusk had the chance to strike back, but never hurt Howard. Now, Howard wanted to give Mr. Tusk another chance. Wallace had no choice but to fight against him. With a walrus fight video playing in the background, the whole scene looked eerie and absurd. Hearing Wallace's screams, Allie and Teddy rushed toward the mansion. The battle grew more intense. Howard told Wallace, "If you want to live, you must kill me. After my death, you will spend the rest of your life as a walrus." Between death and the fate of being a walrus, Wallace had no choice but to accept the latter. To force him to act, Howard pulled a huge axe from inside his costume. Wallace reacted quickly. He drove his tusk into Howard's foot, then stabbed him to death with the sharp tusks. At that moment, Allie and Teddy finally arrived. Seeing Wallace in such a monstrous state, Allie burst into tears. LaPointe wanted to kill Wallace, but Allie stopped him. A year later, Allie and Teddy visited a zoo. Wallace had made this place his home. Allie called his name several times, but he never appeared, until she tossed him a mackerel, his favorite fish. Wallace finally came out to eat. He tore into the fish like a true animal, but was he really an animal? Allie believed that crying was what separated humans from animals. When Wallace saw Allie, he shed tears. So the question remained, was he still human?